Hello everyone, it's Darren, your cowboy economist. And today I'm coming to you to give you another way of thinking about tariffs and international trade. I'll bet you a bourbon that if you're for tariffs now, you won't be by the end of this video. If I've done a good job of explaining why Reagan spurred the greatest economic boom in world history, you will conclude that the protectionist trade tariffs and policies actually increase scarcity and poverty and should be abolished altogether. And that free trade and free enterprise create peace and prosperity and should be embraced entirely. I'll start with some script flipping that will set the stage for the essential lesson, which I will overlay Frederick Bastiat's famous four-price concept over the framework of supply-side economics to clearly demonstrate how we are only shooting ourselves in the foot and perhaps following a historical pattern of a trade war in which reciprocal escalation escalates to the extremes and we end up with a real shooting war. We freed ourselves from the Cold War to enter a world of booming prosperity, and now we are backing ourselves into a new Cold War with one of our best business partners because we don't understand some of the most basic tenets of economics. There are better ways of dealing with our problems with China than this ludicrous, dangerous, and disruptive trade war. And I will also show you how to falsify my theses, following on Karl Popper, and I will explain why I hope I'm wrong, and why I may be wrong, and why Trump's gambit might actually work. But I don't think I'm wrong, any more than I think Reagan was wrong, or any of these economists who wrote these books behind me, which represent the best thought of the Austrian School of Economics, the Chicago School of Economics, the synthesis that came together under the supply-siders, also known as the Reaganauts, that brought it all together, and then, of course, a whole lot of work that's been done since then. I think these guys, almost every one of these books warn against trade wars and tariffs. And so I've got the 101 reasons why tariffs are a really bad idea. And I can just go from one book to the next and just read one great line after another, which explains it. And so, I don't think I'm wrong. I could be. But the people behind me, the Mises Institute here in Alabama, the Acton Institute back in Michigan, Harry Verizer's Detroit School of Austrian Economics, we're all in agreement. This tariff thing is a fiasco. And I'll do more to show you why this is headed towards disaster. I'll show you another way. I'll show you an alternative. I'll show you a solution that will enable us to enter into an era of abundance, a period of peace and prosperity that we can hardly imagine today. Any more than people could imagine escaping Carter's stagflation at the time, or the economic boom that would ensue under Reagan and Clinton because of their supply-side free trade policies. So let's begin. The main reason I suspect why even Mensa-level intellects are confused about tariffs is because the terminology itself is designed to veil the fact that the tariff is a tax, which is levied not on China, but on the American consumer. No Chinaman ever pays one red penny of the tariff. The tariffs are paid by the importers at the border and then are passed on to the consumer by being baked into the price of the good, which is now higher by the amount of the tax. Okay? The tariff isn't paid by the Chinese, it's concealed into the price of the good. And that's why we call tariffs the concealed tax. The big mistake Americans are making in thinking about tariffs today is to misunderstand who pays the tax. It's us. We are letting the government penalize us. We're letting Uncle Sam force us to pay more for products that we previously paid less for when we were free. You must understand that with a tariff, the main thing that you are surrendering is your freedom to buy from whom you want, when you want. The second thing that you're surrendering is your money to Uncle Sam, because it's a tax. But none of this could happen if you didn't surrender your prerogative to think carefully about what is actually being foisted upon us. I miss the days when Republicans opposed taxes and were free traders. People, it's a huge tax. If Obama came along and tried to enact these huge taxes and disrupted these elaborate supply chains that have been in the decades in the making, Republicans would lose our bleeping minds. But under the guise of a tariff on China, we suck it down like Kool-Aid. I know that a lot of people just want this regime to be successful, but do we have to adopt protectionist policies of the left in order to be right today? I think not. The more Uncle Sam sucks away from us in taxes, the more difficult it is to remain afloat. To flip the script on this, since enacting a tariff penalizes the consumers in the protected area, in other words, since raising a tariff on China is actually raising a tax on Americans, it can easily be seen now as shooting ourselves in the foot. And like your mom always warned you, don't jump off a cliff just because your friends are doing it. Simply because other countries are crushing their people under the weight of these encumbersome taxes doesn't mean that we should too, just to make it fair. That's not the definition of fair trade, okay? As a trade tactic, these tariffs are the equivalent of saying, if you don't stop shooting yourself in the foot, we're going to start shooting ourselves in the foot. It's really crazy that we're doing it this way. So why do we do it? Because we don't like China. We don't like that China puts such high tariffs on our products. So what? Why should we give up their cheap goods simply because they won't buy our cheap stuff? It might not be a total win-win, but it's still a win-win for us. We still come out way ahead of the game. Remember, for every dollar a cheap Chinese good saves us, that's one more dollar earned, as Ben Franklin might say. One more dollar that we can save or invest or buy in another product. Our dollars go farther because Chinese goods are so much cheaper. So why should we shoot ourselves in the foot? Because China's dictators won't take their foot off the necks of their people. Why should we let Uncle Sam do to us what Chairman Mao did to them? China has actually steadily been opening up free trade zones all along their coasts. We should hail their moves away from communism towards free market capitalism as a good thing, not as a threat. The best place to learn about China's free trade zones is in Reagan's most quoted economist, the great George Gilder's latest book, Life After Capitalism, which not only solves Adam Smith's 250-year, these are in chronological order, by the way, and Gilder, this is one of the most amazing economic books I have ever read, okay? And he not only solves Adam Smith's 250-year-old material superstition, but he really does lay the framework for the emerging economy, which we'll talk about at the end of this talk here. So I think that book actually will become as great and as well recognized as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And if not as successful as that, it will at least become as hailed, I believe, as Gilder's 81 work, Wealth and Poverty, which became kind of the handbook for the whole Reagan movement, kind of our playbook, so to speak. So let's move on here. Let's talk about the protectionism against the flood of foreign goods. Some say that we need to have protectionism. We need to protect ourselves against the flood of foreign goods. Note well the language. They want to stop the flow of goods. In a world where there's so much evil and scarcity and suffering, I say, if you want to let your goods flow, baby, I say bring it on. We're Americans. We're capitalists. We're consumers. And we are open for business, and we are happy to pay you fair market price. Thank you very much. This is another sign, frankly, that America is the least racist country in the world. We'll buy from anyone so long as it's good and cheap. Milton Friedman said, the great virtue of the market system is that it does not care what color people are. It does not care what their religion is. It only cares whether they can produce something you want to buy. It is the most effective system we have discovered to enable people who hate one another to deal with one another and help each other. We should see tariffs. Here's another script flipper. We should see tariffs as a kind of forced discrimination. If Americans were truly free and we all agreed that cheap Chinese products are bad for us, we'd simply stop buying them. Another way of looking at this is like how blacks are constantly being persuaded nowadays not to buy products from anyone but other blacks, even if they cost more. It might help some of those black producers who are in business, but it hurts all black consumers because of the higher prices. Like higher taxes or inflation, they're essentially a pay cut. Either way, you've just been pickpocketed. Your earnings don't go as far as they used to. If we really hated Chinamen and wished their defeat, we'd simply stop buying their goods. We not need to have Big Brother come in and enact a penalty for buying products from China. That's what a tariff is. It's like Big Brother coming in and saying, damn you comrades, you didn't stop buying cheap Chinese goods, so we're going to raise the price of those cheap goods so that you must now buy the more expensive stuff that you chose not to buy before we enacted the tariff. And there go your freedoms, and there goes your money. So now, perhaps now is a good time, a good place in this talk to take a step back and quickly turn to another confusing issue and turn it on its head. And that is the fallacious trade imbalance, this trade deficit, the difference between the amount that we export and the amount that we import. There's all kinds of people that think that there's a catastrophe that we import so much more than we export and always have. In a sense, there is never and can never be a trade deficit. Let me explain in the way that one of my heroes, Captain David Bruhan, explained it to me. When an American buys a television from a Japanese maker for $100, he receives exactly $100 worth of value for his purchase. He surely would have bought that television from an American if it were the same price and quality, right? The value of the TV is $100 no matter from where it comes, okay? Until at least someone figures out a way to bring to market one that's just as good for only $99. But until that happens, that TV is worth $100, okay? So when this trade takes place, there is no deficit. The American got what he paid for regardless of from whom and from where he bought it. When we talk about trade deficits, we must think in an entirely different way. We should see that trade deficits are really a surplus, an outpouring of American wealth and prosperity and production. We make so much money here in America that we can buy not only most everything that we make, but we can buy most everything else that everybody else makes as well. We are 4% of the world's population, but we consume 41% of the consumer goods. We aren't depleting our wealth by purchasing cheaper goods from China any more than we'd be depleting our wealth by purchasing cheaper goods from the guy around the corner. A penny saved is a penny earned. We have forgotten this very valuable lesson. It's about opportunity cost. You're down 2 pennies on the whole deal, okay? So the problem isn't whether we have trade deficits with other countries. It is really whether we are spending more than we earn. Are we living within our means? We can quite feasibly continue to import more and more, having a greater and greater trade deficit each and every year. But so long as we lived within our means and saved, we could keep getting rich until we made nothing in America but more wealth. Capital can become our greatest export. And the returns, if we're good at it, can be astronomical, all while providing us greater leisure and prosperity while lifting the third world out of grinding poverty. That's what Reagan's boom did. In the first 10 years, 2 billion people across the planet were lifted out of grinding poverty. In other words, less than earnings of $1 a day. The economic transformation that has taken place in just my lifetime is incredible. And yet we are beginning to we've forgotten how it happened. More on that and not. So I want to switch gears now here and talk about protecting workers. Some people clearly see that cheap goods help the poor people the most. They're the people who need to stretch their dollars the farthest. But these same people say that the poorest American workers need tariff protection, or else them foreigners are going to take them jobs. This is Ross Perot's giant sucking town. All them jobs are going to go straight to Mexico. So let's turn old Ross on his head here too while we're at it. There's only one protection for workers: competition. Competition for his service. That's the worker's real protection. Wages to workers go up not when competition is reduced, but when competition is increased. I know this is kind of counterintuitive for some people. The main driver of wages is always productivity. The more productive a worker can be, the more he'll make. This applies whether he's working in a factory or working for himself as a tradesman or as a professional. He makes more when he finds a way to be more productive. As Milton Friedman explained long ago, the most reliable protection for workers is provided by the existence of many employers. The employers who protect a worker are those who would like to hire him. The demand for his services make it in the self-interest of the employer to pay him the full value of his work. If his employer doesn't, some other employer may be ready to and be willing to do so. It's costly for employers to locate desirable employees and for employees to find desirable employers. Furthermore, a worker is protected from his employers by the existence of other employers for whom he can then go to work. An employer is protected against the exploitation of his employees by the existence of other workers whom he can then hire. The consumer is protected from exploitation by a given seller by the existence of other sellers from whom he can buy. Why do we have a poor postal service, poor long-distance train service, poor schools? Because in each case, there's essentially only one place from which we can get that service. When workers get higher wages through the free market, on the other hand, when they get their raises by firms competing for one another for the best workers, by workers competing against one another for the best jobs, those higher wages are at nobody's expense. They can come only from higher productivity, greater capital investment, more widely diffused skills. The whole pie is bigger. There's more for the worker. There's also more for the employer, the investor, the consumer, and even the tax collector. Unquote. This is the message with which we ought to be winning over the workers. Freedom of movement, because their skills are in demand. Not that they're locked at a company that is dependent on some unfair government trade protection. Furthermore, we can use simple statistics to show that pound for pound, American workers are the best. Well, maybe I shouldn't put it that way, although we are pretty fat and happy on balance. I mean to say that our workers can kick your workers' ass, and I've got the stats to prove it. We are paid more for one simple reason. We produce more. That is to say, we are more productive, and we are getting better every day. We are already way ahead of the world when it comes to productivity, and we should not turn back to a policy that hamstrings us. With 346 million souls, Americans are only 4% of the world's population. China has almost 1.5 billion people and are 17.2% of the world's population. But Americans are vastly richer and far more productive. Using round numbers here, the American GDP is 28 million compared to 28 trillion. America's GDP is 28 trillion compared to China's 18 trillion. The average American produces $81,000 of that GDP per capita. But the Chinaman is only producing 13,000. We're only 4% of the world's population compared to their 17, but we consume 41% of the planet's consumer goods. Only Switzerland and Ireland, surprisingly, beat us in per capita GDP. The Swiss are rich because they're hospitable to investment capital. The Irish are rich because, why? It's not that they're exporting their cuisine, as we all know, that's for sure. It must be that they spend all their sober hours at work, and afterwards they're too drunk to go shopping, so they So they just save and invest all until their portfolios are on cruise control and they don't have to work anymore. And they can then drink all day. And because the beer is good and cheap, that won't deplete their reserves either. Believe me, there are thousands of people like that moving down here to the redneck Riviera. They've been living on their money for a long time. And they're not landing on my tiny island, however, because there's nothing left here on this island. We're landlocked. But the condos are going in over there like hotcakes. So now let me switch to how our economy is evolving. America got rich by making and growing goods. But nobody is getting rich manufacturing buggy whips nowadays or plowing fields with a mule. Protectionism slows the economic evolutionary process by artificially misdirecting energies and scarce resources away from their most efficient and profitable uses towards less productive activity. Production, manufacturing will always go where it can be most productive at the cheapest cost for labor. Americans aren't and haven't been competing for the cheapest jobs in the labor market since I was a teenager. Plus, we're already at full employment. Who's going to do the work at all these new factories that we're reshoring? Americans don't do that work anymore. We're going to have to import a bunch of immigrants to do the work. Probably the same people that were doing the work in Mexico. We're going to have to import those people. But we're also, at the same time, we're attempting to choke the flow of legal immigration. Now, I don't want to get off on a side tangent too much here, but I think that our legal immigration problem is a massive issue. But the assimilation problem is even far worse. And an immigration population that does not assimilate will eventually, perhaps quickly, become a menace. Just ask old Europe. We are really lucky here in America because most of our best immigrants are Hispanics, and most of them are Catholic, God-fearing and hardworking. Down here on the coast of America, we have lots of hardworking Jamaicans too in our service industries, and these are wonderful people. But the Mexicans are still building everything around here, and business is booming here in Alabama. I also affirm the military readiness argument. We've got to be able to build our own, we've got to be able to keep ourselves safe. But even that argument is weakened by the argument which says that the strength of our international friendships trump our need to be totally self-dependent for our own self-defense. If we have lots of friends all over the world building weapons, theirs often can do as well as ours. But I am sure glad that we are building the best weapons at present because I am not confident in our friendships. America is undeniably the greatest, richest, widest, and deepest market of consumers. We need to be producers, undoubtedly. But that doesn't mean we must be manufacturers. We can be creators of manufacturing rather than the actual maker. Workers were replaced by robots on the assembly line. But many of those workers just learned how to make the robots on the assembly line. And they made more money by being vastly more productive. We must envision the time. Here's your counterfactual. We must envision a time very soon when the most advanced nations' workers work from home on their computers and have in-house a 3D printer, which can manufacture most any of the goods that we are currently getting from China today. Cities will become less like Detroit, where you see plants everywhere, and they'll become more like Kansas City, where all you see are neighborhoods everywhere, and parks, and thriving social centers. But you see little heavy industrial in Kansas City. It's a rich, sophisticated, happy, cosmopolitan town. Now, Detroit itself, I lived there for 17 years, has been transforming itself into the next economy. The automation alley is what they've been calling it for decades now. And they have been transforming into this next economy as well. But this trade war has the potential to destroy Detroit because, in particular, Detroit has been busily elaborating its supply chain all over the world in order to stay competitive with an increasing advance of foreign automakers. Our aim should not be manufacturing per se, for manufacturing's sake. But rather our aim should be increasing production and productivity because that's what actually raises wages. And most importantly, it's that production, that supply is the very thing which creates its own demand, which leads us to the heart of the lesson. Which do you want? Which is better to found a human society on, scarcity or abundance? I will show you now how protectionism causes scarcity and supply-side free trading creates abundance. But first, let me ask, which is better, low prices or high prices? Anytime you get into the realm of economics, you're forced to talk about these two facets of prices, low and high prices. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to introduce a concept from Frederick Bastiat's 1845 book, Economic Sophisms, which he wrote some 75 years almost after Adam Smith wrote his amazing book, which was an open and shut case against tariffs. 250 years ago, we had all the reasons not to do what we're doing today, but we didn't learn our lesson. Bastiat, 75 years later, frustrated with the fact that we haven't embraced free trade and abolished tariffs, writes this book with the intention of it becoming the handbook of free trade. And in his 5th chapter, he talks about the four kinds of prices, which I'm going to describe for you here. So what do you want? Do you want low prices or high prices? If you're struggling to answer that question, good for you. You're experiencing the cognitive dissonance that is the enduring tension between producer and consumer. Because we're both. We are both producer and consumer. Tariffs benefit the producer, some producers, very few producers actually, but at the expense of every consumer. And when you understand this concept, you begin to understand the difference between scarcity and abundance. But before I get any farther, let's get back to the concept of prices. I'm going to go ahead and draw this back up here. It's another little talk I give. Let me just do it out. Let me just take one of these blank sheets here and say, okay, so what I'm actually going to draw here are the 4 prices, okay? And so here we have price. We have high prices, and we have low prices, okay? Which do you prefer, okay? Well, if you're the consumer going into a store, you want the lowest prices possible, right? But if you own the store, or if you're an investor in the store, or if you're one of the suppliers whose products are being sold in that store, or even if you are the guy that's just picking up the carts in the parking lot at that store, you want to be able to sell at the highest prices possible. Because even Cartman knows if the price is too damn high, though, people will say, screw you again and again. So the Cartman also knows that if the prices are too low, that business will go out of business as well. So it's pretty clear that the consumer wants the lowest prices possible and the seller wants as high prices as possible. How do you reconcile this? You don't. So which is better, high prices or low prices? Well, we have a mechanism for mediating and equalizing supply and demand, and that's called the price. Okay, so there is another way, however, of deciding or being able to determine not whether a price is high or low, because both high and low prices have 2 causes. And this is where it starts getting really interesting, because as Bastiat points out, that sometimes we find ourselves in a historical situation in which the protectionists get what they want and the prices actually go down, or vice versa, the free traders got what they wanted and the price actually went up. So how do we know whether a high price or a low price is a good price or a bad price? So we can actually chart this out on an XY axis graph using our supply and demand curves. Da-da-da. So here's your supply curve. Do that in red. And here is your demand curve. And we'll do that in blue. Okay, so what's the difference between supply side and demand side economics? Okay, Reagan's the supply sider, John Maynard Keynes is the icon, of the demand supplied economists. These guys believe that the way to stimulate an economy, the basis of economy, is by demand. They see shoppers in the stores, they think the economy is doing really well. So what they want to do is they want to incentivize people going out and spending more money, okay? Because if you spend more money, then the suppliers will be happy, all the stores will be happy, and everything will be great. But the problem with demand side economics is really all it does is it moves the demand curve thusly, like advertising works, okay? It just makes us want to have greater demand, willing to spend more money on the products that we're purchasing. But that's the whole basis behind demand side economics. Supply side economics, on the other hand, realizes that with John Baptiste Say's law, John Baptiste Say said that supply creates its own demand. We know even a teenager, a broke teenager understands that before he can make any demands in the marketplace, he's got to supply something. He's got to get some money. And you get money by providing a product or service that someone wants or needs. Supply comes first. Demand merely steers as a signal light would to suppliers what business is the most profitable, most highly demanded business. But supply creates the demand. And that's the key thing. So Reagan's whole concept was to do the things that incentivize supply, to have more and more. So this is the amount of goods, this axis here, amount of goods. Whereas this side is the price of goods. And so the supply and demand curves work as scissors, kind of always cutting, but always balancing supply and demand in an imperfect equilibrium. You got to think of this as an abstract, huge auction house where buyers and sellers are constantly negotiating a price that balances supply and demand curves, okay? So now that we've shown, okay, so let me finish the point behind supply side economics. When you move the supply curve, as supply siders want, what happens to the price? The price goes down the curve. So we should point out that this is the whole point of supply side economics, to have more stuff at a lower price. That is what we call abundance. So this quadrant is abundance, okay? Now let's take this demand side. How can high prices be in any way good, okay? Well, high prices happen when demand is high and supply is low. But demand side economics, what does it do? What's the price on it? It raises the price, okay? So this quadrant, however, we could call prosperity. In other words, we have so much money that we no longer care about the price. We're going to get what we demand anyways, all right? This is also a good place to be in. So these are the two good prices. What are the two bad prices? Well, it's becoming very clear, obviously, that when you have very little supply and there's no demand, what are we really dealing with here? When we have high prices, but there's no supply, what are we talking about here? Here, we are talking deprivation. And here, just regular old scarcity. So, I've made the claim that protectionism creates deprivation and scarcity, and supply side economics creates abundance and prosperity. How does this happen? Because when you are a supplier and you don't have any competition, you're going to raise your price. And you don't have to work as hard to produce a product of quality while your profit margins are getting higher. Let's put it this way. Let's go back to that $100 TV example. If that TV came from China, for example, and there was a 25% tariff on it, now that Chinese television would cost $125 in America, right? So what do you think all the American manufacturers of televisions are going to do? Do you think they're just going to go, oh, we're going to keep our prices at $101 where we were getting undercut by our Chinese competitors? Or are they going to raise their price up to $124, where they can get all of the business that China can no longer get. When that happens, first of all, what happens to the Chinese company and all the workers over there? Well, unless they are able to lower their price, unless they had a huge profit margin somehow, they're just not going to ship. They're just not going to send goods to our country. So that means we're moving down the supply curve here, right, towards scarcity. Okay, there's fewer goods in the total basket of goods for the American consumer. Okay. On the other hand, what's the effect of higher prices? Well, anytime a price raises, there will be less of it produced, okay, less of it purchased. And so it might help some of the producers who can now charge more for the demanded goods. But for the most part, all that's going to end up happening is the demand will ultimately follow on as a fall, because people's dollars don't go as far. We're spending more money on necessities and less on our preferences. And so both forms of bad prices are brought about by tariff protectionism. Now, I said that I want to falsify. I want to show you how my thesis can be falsified. Now, I also let me just start off by explaining my biggest fear about why I might be wrong. The last thing I want to do is make it difficult for a winning strategy to find its way through to success. So I'm somewhat reluctant to talk about these things I believe in to the core of my being. Because I understand that what Trump is attempting to do, although he may be misguided about how tariffs actually hurt consumers, I do believe that what he's doing is he is trying to force open China's markets to us. But like I say, China's markets are opening to us. I am more worried about their theft of our intellectual property, frankly. And but China's in a really tough spot demographically. They have been murdering their daughters for decades, and so their demographics are off. The people are getting richer, but they have, some of the sick stuff that the Chinese surveillance state does with this social credit score to the Chinese people, that is not going to end well for the Chinese leadership, I will assure you. And so I think some of this is that we need to not upset the apple cart here when we can see that there are some very good trends happening in China, okay? To me, it would be kind of like invading Czechoslovakia right before the Berlin Wall fell. It's just, there's a smarter way of dealing with our problems. And when we understand that the trade relationships that we can have. So let me go back to what I think Trump is doing. First of all, I think that Trump may be attempting to break China, okay? And that fear, I'm afraid of that, but I understand that if you can get the Communist Party, if we can somehow make it so that the Communist Party is overthrown by the people and that real liberal elected republic can then ensue, that would be a tremendous development for the whole world. However, that is a tremendously dangerous gambit. I think that what Trump is attempting is I think that he understands the shooting ourselves in the foot concept that I'm talking about. I just simply think that he says, listen, China, we are in a lot better shape than you are. We can afford to shoot ourselves in the foot, and we will shoot ourselves in the foot until you stop shooting yourself in the head. I think that the whole point of these tariffs, and I had to go and check, because in the last month, I have seen some of my heroes seem to completely flip-flop against these Reagan beliefs. I saw one of my greatest heroes, Larry Kudlow, who wrote this fantastic book about how Jack Kennedy was also a supply-sider, okay? Larry Kudlow, one of the lions of supply-side economics, helped write the 2017 package that was, in my mind, the 81 Reagan-Kemp bill redo. I think what Art Laffer, Stephen Moore, and Larry Kudlow put together for Trump in 2017 was one of the most important things. And I think that I just got to throw in, I talked about Say's Law, but another thing that Art Laffer talked about is, and Art Laffer was not only the man who invented the famous Laffer curve, and this is the book that really kind of made all of the different schools of economic thought gel together. This is Jude Wanniski's 1978 book, The Way the World Works. Jude Wanniski was kind of the Boswell to Art Laffer, as Boswell was the aide-de-camp and compatriot of the great Dr. Samuel Johnson. Laffer was Wanniski was Laffer's Boswell, and he wrote in this book all these great ideas that Laffer was laying down for him. And one of them was not only the Laffer curve, but it was Laffer who came up with the idea of the government wedge. And the government wedge is what stands between capital and labor. Okay? And the government wedge is made up of taxes and regulation. Okay? It is a part of the cost of doing business. And if this wedge gets so big that it eats into the profit margin, labor and capital will just remain on the sidelines. The real result of tax cuts on businesses is to make the future prospects of profitability look more favorable. When you expand the government wedge, you simply make prospects of future profitability less favorable. And so capital flees investments and labor sits on the sidelines. In order for capital to be able and willing to get into the game, they have to be able to see an opportunity for profit in the future. Reagan's whole point, and this is what Trump did again in 2017, his whole point was to reduce taxes and regulations, and that just unleashed capital. And that's why we saw so much investment activity and so much new growth and new ventures launched as soon as President Trump got elected in 2016. And we began seeing that when he got elected this time. But then he started doing this trade war and the markets panicked because many businessmen understand this, even though most economists have not read these books on economic theory. They do, to some extent, understand these concepts, although it's very sad to say that we Reaganites, the Reagan economists, the supply-siders, we are a definite minority. Most of the economic schools on the face of the planet today are teaching neo-Keynesianism. They're teaching macroeconomics rather than teaching microeconomics, being able to see, like as the Austrians taught us, the praxeology of being able to put man and his rational decisions at the center of the system. And so we've had this whole top-down command and control system, which thinks that the economy is merely this grand machine full of levers and wheels, and we just need a master machine runner, and it will dispense all of the goods that our demagogic leaders have told us we're entitled to. But the problem is, when that happens, when we put a supposed expert machine runner in charge of our economy, it goes smash. Because the economy is not a machine. It is more properly seen as a garden. And as Friedrich von Hayek said in his groundbreaking, monumental 1944 book, The Road to Serfdom, he says the proper attitude of an economist towards the market economy is that of a gardener. And his attempt is, his whole goal is to ascertain, what are the best conditions for growth? How do you amend the soil? How does this plant grow? What does this plant need? What are the things that enable this growth activity to take place? How do they bloom? How do they grow best? How do you propagate them? And how do they produce marketable crop? That's the way to look at a market economy, as an organic thing, as a living thing, and an individual thing as well. And so what we need to do is we need to let a million flowers bloom. And so let me finish here with my alternative. How about this? How about we get rid of all tariffs? All zero. I was shocked last week when I heard one of my heroes, frankly, Victor Davis Hanson, was using Milton Friedman's words, with whom he was a friend, to try to make the case that that tariffs aren't recessionary. And it's like he doesn't realize that Milton fought fiercely his entire life against the tariff, and he may be the first person actually to offer a constitutional amendment abolishing the tariffs. He was so confident in their destructive effects. And so when Milton's own living friends get him wrong, what hope is there that Joe Sixpack is going to be able to understand these concepts? Well, I have far more faith in the average Joe Sixpack than I have in your typical egg-headed academician in these universities today, who usually can't see anything besides maintaining their own privilege to indoctrinate the emerging schools, the emerging minds full of mush with their progressive nonsense. And so for me, the whole thing is, what are we going to do to create a situation, an economic environment that is hospitable to business? Because I call it my field of dream theory of economics, which is that if you build a hospitable business climate, the businesses will come and they will set down roots and they will grow like corn in Iowa. We just need to get the government out of the way. So one of the things that we needed, and so I thought about, I actually wrote this speech about 20 different ways. And one was to start off by saying that if China really wants to beat Trump in this trade war, they should just abolish all tariffs. Capital investment would flow to China like you cannot believe. It would be a boom town. And you think about what would that mean for the average Chinaman's purchasing power? Oh my gosh. So, they're all working their butts off, but they're not really getting anywhere. And that's one of the most amazing things about market capitalism. It is such an amazing dynamo of wealth creation that it is amazing how many burdens of bad government can be burdened on it. And so when you look at the Chinese, for them to abolish their tariffs, they would have this huge influx of not only foreign investment, but friendly feeling would come in like crazy. And so we should do the same damn thing too. It would be so good for us to be the free trade place. Let me also point out that I know that history is written by the victors, but the unknown history of the American Civil War is, in my mind, hinges on the Corwin Amendment, in which Abraham Lincoln, right before the war broke out, promised the South that he would never, ever, the amendment would keep slavery in perpetuity. And so the Civil War was not about slavery, okay? It was about trade. It was about sovereignty. This all kind of got rolling. We always hear this thing, oh yeah, until they started the income tax, we funded our government through tariffs, which is true, but there was no government back then. I mean, it was just so small. And nevertheless, it was still a majorly hot contested issue. In 1928 and then again in 1930, the Tariff of Abominations were enacted by, it was Jackson's taxes. And he actually was going to, and this caused the nullification crisis. And he was going to jail his vice president, John Calhoun, for not complying. And they had this force bill that was going to force it to happen. The nation almost split up back in 1830. And of course, it was 35 years later that the important thing to understand is that all the tariffs were being paid by the Southerners. They were the ones that had to import goods. The Northerners, they were getting their stuff from the Southern manufacturers, and they were primarily exporters. They were making money off of the Southern cotton, okay? So this whole thing that the North, if they wanted to, they could have shut the South down in a heartbeat. Said, we're just not going to buy your slave-made cotton anymore. But they didn't. The North was making just as much money, even more so. So when you consider that the tariffs were 85% of them were being paid by the South, and yet they were getting about 20% of all the money out of Washington. So they're paying for 85%, but they're only getting 20%. That sounds like getting ripped off. And so the South really wanted to create a free trade area. And go back to Lincoln said it twice to two different people. He says, "What about my tariffs?" The Civil War was fought over tariffs. It was fought over revenue. The North had the Southern planters in a box. The Southerners didn't need the North. They were ready to go on their own. They wanted to just be left alone. And the North wouldn't let them go. Anyways, that's not the only time. There are lots of other explanations where tariff and trade restrictions, a trade war, led to a real war. And so first of all, we should be we need to be completely conscientious of the fact that we are entering into a very deadly game in which the escalation to extremes is very, very likely. And that it's very difficult once sometimes this stricter chain of logic starts being followed. It's very tough to break that chain in that course of events. And so I just don't like this, anything about it. When the alternative is to say, America, we're finally going to be free. We're going to get rid of all tariffs. America is a free trade zone. We are free. We don't charge tariffs between states. You don't have to pay a tariff when you buy something from Michigan. Although there's something to be said for that, I think. I'm from Ohio, so I'm always doing this rivalry with my friends up in that state up north. But nonetheless, we don't set up tariffs between states because it causes scarcity and deprivation. It makes things difficult. So we shouldn't do it with foreign countries with whom we are trying to be friends anyhow. We want their cheap stuff. And here's the other thing. I fail to make this point. You know, when we make it so that the Chinese businesses that can no longer export to us, that when they go out of business, those people no longer have money to buy American goods, okay? So when we put up trade barriers, and this is more of look, there's lots of reasons to believe that this is actually what caused the Great Depression in the first place, which is that, you know, we were really screwing up our foreign business partners' ability to buy our goods. And so, but the long and short of it is that if we screw everybody else off and make everybody else be autarky, self-sufficient nations, that's not an autocracy. Autocracy is government by a few very rich people. Autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y, is a nation state that is self-sufficient. We should not be moving towards a self-sufficient nation that doesn't export anything or is constantly worried about trade imbalances. We should just be worried about producing as much as we can, creating a business environment that is hospitable to business and productivity. And so let me finish also by saying, not only should we get rid of the tariff, we got to get rid of the corporate tax too. It is a double tax. All of that money has already been taxed. Get rid of capital gains tax. Get rid of corporate tax. Get rid of all these layers of taxes that are concealed and baked into the price of everything that we buy, but we cannot see. Get rid of as many taxes as we possibly can. I like Steve Forbes' idea of going to a flat tax. But again, a flat tax is doing what? It is taxing supply. We want to incentivize supply, and we want to incentivize savings and investment. And you do that by disincentivizing spending. And so for me, I would like to see, and I don't know the best way to do this, but to me, it makes more sense to have a sales tax than a production tax, an earnings tax. A sales tax gives you just a little bit more incentive to say, nope, I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to save that money instead, because penny saved is a penny earned, which can be invested or can be used to purchase something else even more valuable. So, yeah, I think I'm just going to end it like that. I think you guys owe me a bourbon. I think I've proved my point. I hope I have.